Hello there, this is the lesson read aloud recording for lesson 3.03, A New Leader. A new leader meant a huge transition for the young nation. Although John Adams had been George Washington's vice president, he was a very different man. Yet some similar challenges awaited him, especially in the area of foreign policy. The way he and the country responded laid the foundations for growth in the 19th century. Goals for this lesson. List examples of the individual rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Summarize the achievements of the Federalist era. Explain the arguments for and against Hamilton's plan and the differing views of the Constitution they reflected. Recognize the challenges Washington faced as the first president and the precedents he established for the new government. Identify Washington, D.C. as the nation's capital and a planned city. Explain the reasons for the rise of political parties during Washington's administration. Describe the major goals and elements of Hamilton's financial plan. Summarize the key points and significance of Washington's farewell address. Recognize the impact of foreign and domestic crises on the development of policies and political parties. Recognize the major elements of Washington's farewell address. Recognize the major foreign policy challenges of John Adams' presidency and his responses to them. Assess the Alien and Sedition Acts and Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in terms of the reasons for them and their constitutionality. And identify the major issues on which Jefferson and Hamilton disagreed and their positions on those issues. So this is basically a nice goals listing of what you need to know going into the 303 quiz, because this reviews information from lessons 1, 2, and now 3. Okay, make sure you have your lesson answer key in your reading guide, and let's begin starting on page 212 to 215. The Adams administration. As Washington prepared to retire to Mount Vernon, presidential elections met to choose his successor. In the election of 1796, Vice President John Adams won the largest number of electoral votes and became the second president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, second to Adams in the electoral vote count, became vice president. Thus, the president and vice president were from different political parties, a source of tension that the framers of the Constitution had not anticipated when they set up the presidential selection process, and which would later be changed by an amendment to the Constitution. As president, John Adams was a committed but often testy public servant. His wife Abigail once claimed his only flaw was irritability. Like Washington, Adams was committed to a strong federal government. Also like Washington, he was highly critical of the revolution in France and worried about American involvement in European wars. Adams reached out to his new vice president and former friend Thomas Jefferson, and at first it appeared that some of the bickering might end. Okay, let's read about the Electoral College. Under the system established by the framers of the Constitution, while the people of the United States vote for candidates of their choice as president and vice president, they do not directly elect them. Instead, each state has a number of presidential electors equal to the total number of the state's senators and representatives in Congress. These electors, who as a group are known as the Electoral College, elect the president and vice president. The electors generally cast their electoral votes for the candidate who receives the most popular votes, although they are not bound by law to do so. Originally, the candidate who received the most electoral votes became president. The candidate with the second highest number of votes became vice president, but this practice was changed after the election of 1800. Okay, then let's read about the XYZ affair. Immediately upon assuming office, Adams faced a mounting crisis with France. In retaliation for the Jay Treaty, the French had begun seizing American ships that were trading with Britain. To make matters worse, France refused to receive the newly arrived ambassador to the United States. Seeking to resolve the situation peaceably, Adams sent another delegation to negotiate terms with the French government. Upon their arrival in Paris, the Americans were told by 3 representatives of the French government that Foreign Minister Talleyrand would not meet with them until they made a loan to France and paid a substantial bribe to Talleyrand. Not a sixpence, countered the representatives, who returned home. Back in the United States, Adams made public the bribery letters from the 3 French diplomats whom he called X, Y, and Z. Adams took a firm stand against the French and called for a buildup of the U.S. Navy. Between 1898 and 1800, new American naval vessels defended American merchant ships on the high seas, fighting an undeclared war against the French. George Washington returned to the capital and helped Alexander Hamilton draw up plans for war. Meanwhile, Adams and the young American Navy prepared for what some thought would be a French invasion of the United States from the French colonies in the West Indies. Liberty and equality in Hawaii. In the West Indies, however, the French had their hands full when the French-ruled colony of Santo Domingo, now called Haiti, launched its own revolution. Inspired by the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality, slaves and free blacks in Haiti rebelled against their French masters in 1791. Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, emerged as a leader of the revolutionaries and fought to establish the first black republic in the New World. While Americans steamed over the XYZ affair and fought an undeclared war against France at sea, Toussaint's government appealed to the United States, hinting that their country would welcome American warships near their ports. In December 1798, President Adams hosted Toussaint's representative, Joseph Bonnell, as his dinner guest. It was the first time a U.S. president welcomed a man of African descent to dine and discuss policy. Because Adams supported the Haitians and feared a French invasion from the West Indies, he ordered the greatest part of the fleet to General Toussaint, who has a great desire to see some ships of war belonging to America. Tensions mounted between France and the United States. The Alien and Sedition Crisis. By 1798, many Americans were turning against their old revolutionary ally, France. Democratic Republicans, slow to distance themselves from the Revolutionary Republic, lost many congressional seats. At the same time, Adams was losing the support of many of his fellow Federalists. As Adams tried to uphold Washington's policy of neutrality, many Federalists clamored for a war with France. Some began to look to Alexander Hamilton for leadership. Hamilton resigned as Secretary of the Treasury to accept as a position as second in command of the American Army under General Washington, wanted the United States to forge a military alliance with Britain against France. But Adams was determined to resist any such ties to the former mother country. Facing dissent within his own party, Adams also suffered vigorous criticism from the Republicans, whose effective spokesman was none other than his Vice President Thomas Jefferson. The two men had once been close friends. Now they were barely on speaking terms. As the United States moved closer to what many believed would be an all-out war with France, Federalists worried about recent immigrants to the United States. A large portion of them were enthusiastic supporters of French revolutionary ideals, and they openly sided with the Republicans. If war broke out, what would the newcomers aid France? Prompted by this fear, Federalists in Congress passed a series of laws in 1798 known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Enemies Act, which President Adams signed into law, allowed the president to arrest and deport enemy immigrants in the event of war. Another Alien Act gave the president the power in peacetime to deport non-citizens he considered dangerous. Another new law, the Naturalization Act, required immigrants to wait 14 years before applying for U.S. citizenship. Previously, immigrants had to wait 5 years to apply for citizenship. The law was designed to delay new immigrants from voting, since they were likely to vote for Democratic Republicans. Perhaps the most alarming were the Sedition Acts. They made it a crime to print any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States. These new laws imposed penalties, including imprisonment, for criticizing the government in speech or print. Republicans loudly objected. They rightly identified the Sedition Act as an all-out assault on their party, as well as its many immigrant supporters. Matthew Carey, a prominent Republican newspaperman, warned that under this execrable law, to laugh at the cut of a congressman's coat, to give dinner to a Frenchman, is to let him sleep in your bed, will be treason. In the course of the next 2 years, no aliens were deported, but 25 people were tried, and 10 of those were convicted under the Sedition Act. One was Congressman Matthew Lyon of Vermont, who was in prison for denouncing the law. The Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. The Alien and Sedition Acts aroused strong criticism of the Federalists. If the federal government could pass and enforce such laws, then what did the First Amendment mean? Were the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly, nothing more than words on parchment? At his Virginia plantation, Monticello, Vice President Jefferson collaborated with James Madison on a response. Jefferson, who had long distrusted a strong central government, saw the Alien and Sedition Acts as a form of tyranny. Madison, the principal author of the Constitution, concluded that in this case the system of checks and balances had not worked to preserve liberty. Alarmed for the future of the Republic, and with an eye on the coming presidential election, Jefferson anonymously penned a set of resolutions for approval by the Kentucky legislature. Madison did the same for Virginia. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions denounced the Alien and Sedition Acts as unconstitutional and obnoxious acts. They argued that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. The the resolutions claimed that it was up to each individual state to decide its response to such federal laws. Kentucky did not rule out the possibility that such legislation would drive those states into revolution. In effect, Jefferson and Madison claimed that Virginia and Kentucky had a constitutional right to nullify the federal legislation. That is, to declare the federal laws invalid and without legal force. This claim for states' rights would remain a subject of heated debate until the Civil War. When the Kentucky legislature passed a series of resolutions that declared the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional, other states took note. Some firmly rejected the Virginia and Kentucky claims. Some argued that only the Supreme Court could decide if federal laws were constitutional, which is the current practice in the United States. But early in the life of the young republic, this issue is not yet clear. John Adams sidestepped the coming crisis when he quietly nominated a new minister to France and instructed him to seek peace. The president did not consult his cabinet, many of whom agreed with Hamilton and were eager for a fight with France. Adams' ambassador, William Vans Murray, succeeded in his mission. He negotiated with the new French leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, to end attacks on American shipping and thus avoid all-out war. In 1800, the United States signed a treaty with France, cooling tempers and briefly quieting the drumbeat of war. But Adams' own Federalist Party turned on him, while Jefferson's supporters prepared for what would prove to be a bitterly contested presidential race in November 1800. At the height of this partisan feuding came word that George Washington had died suddenly at his Mount Vernon home. After a day of inspecting his field in sleet and freezing rain, the 67-year-old revolutionary patriot and statesman, anchored to the past and symbol of American unity, succumbed to a throat infection and died on December 14, 1799. Washington's passing seemed to mark the end of the Revolutionary Era. The election of 1800 would complete the transition. The Federalist Era and Perspective. The Federalist Era, the nation's first decade under the new Constitution, proved difficult and tumultuous. Americans continued to argue over the powers of the federal government, the authority of the states, the place of political parties, foreign policy with the European world at war, and the influence of banks, industry, and commerce in a mostly agrarian republic. But by the end of the 1790s, the government of the new United States seemed to be on firm footing, thanks in part to the precedent-setting leadership of George Washington and the financial abilities of Alexander Hamilton. Despite the failings of the Alien and Sedition Acts during his administration, John Adams' skillful international maneuvering did much to keep the young republic out of war and thus ensure the survival of the federal government. During this time, the development of political parties and the depth of their disagreements caught many by surprise. The first generation of American statesmen often clashed bitterly with each other. Despite their partisan battles, both Federalists and Democratic Republicans sought to achieve their goals through the political processes and constitutional channels they had developed in 1787. The fact that the young republic survived the early internal divisions is testimony to the practical skills of American leaders and the strength of the Constitution in laying the foundations of a working government. The greatest accomplishment of the Federalist era was that the Republican government survived and took root in the United States. All right, and that's the end of that. So now complete who's an alien and what's sedition activity. Read the Chapter 8 highlights and complete the quiz. Okay, so make sure you go through this activity here. Let's stop here though, because this recording is almost up to its 15 minutes limit, and we'll pick up in part 2 with the rest of this lesson. So the end here for part 1.